The topic today is tense and aspect in English. Tense and aspect in English is actually a very difficult topic because the way in which tense and aspect is structured in English is, in fact, in many ways quite peculiar to English, even in comparison with other European languages, especially the aspect system, namely the so-called progressive aspect. If you look at other neighboring European languages, which are, of course, very closely related to English, German and Dutch, even French and Spanish, so the major Western European languages, their aspect system is quite different from that of English. And I say even within Western Europe, English speakers find it extraordinarily difficult to learn the French imperfect and whatever, and French and German learners find it very difficult to get their heads around the English aspect system. So there's something funny about the English aspect system, the use of the progressive. So it's quite a challenge, precisely because it is so language specific. So what I want to do, I want to bring some tools of cognitive linguistics, which is basically actually semantic conceptual analysis. Okay, what is cognitive linguistics? Well, in this particular respect, it means looking at the distributional aspects of the verb phrase, the distributional, the structural aspects, if you like, and to ask what are the meanings which are symbolized by these various contrasts which you have. Okay? Okay, I won't be specifically addressing applied linguistic issues, language teaching issues, but I would take it as rather obvious that if you are teaching English, whether as a classroom teacher, whether you're preparing writing teaching materials or designing a syllabus or whatever, if you are engaged in these sorts of activities, it will help if you understand what it is that you are teaching. You don't necessarily have to teach all the terminology and so on, but clearly if you are teaching something like this, it is clearly a good idea if you understand the logic of the system. Okay? But I will leave to other people the actual implementation of this in pedagogical materials or in a pedagogical grammar. Okay, so let's see if this works. Yes. Now, characteristics of the English verb phrase, verb forms. There are a couple of distinctions which are characteristic of the verb phrase in English. One is the tense. English verbs inflect for tense, present tense versus past tense, as we all know. Second is the question of aspect, which is basically simple, well, two aspects are often recognized. I'll be focusing on the first one, simple versus progressive. This is the I talk, I am talking. I talked, I was talking. I have talked, I have been talking. That sort of distinction. And second, which is sometimes recognized, whether it's an aspect or a tense, that's a bit unclear. But this is the have form. I spoke, I have spoken. So perfect with the have or had form. And another feature of the English verb form is the use of auxiliaries and modals. Modals are also very complex in English, as I'm sure you're aware. The can, must, may, might not, and so on and so forth. I won't actually have much to say about that. That will be another lecture and a half, at least, to go into those topics. So my main focus will be on, well, I'll begin by making some remarks on tense, then I'll say something about aspect, and then something about the way in which these two interact. So let's begin with what seems to be quite a straightforward matter, which seems to be a very simple matter, the question of tense. Now, English has two tenses, present and past. Future, well, English doesn't really have a future tense. You make a future by means of modals, by means of will, and various other forms, will, be going to, and so on and so forth. So the English verb does not inflect for future. So there isn't really a future tense as such. You have a present tense and you have a past tense. And, okay, so you have the verb form, or more specifically, the finite verb form, can occur in present tense or past tense. So that is a grammatical distinction. It's a morphological distinction. It's a formal distinction. And the question to ask then is, what is the meaning behind this distinction? What does it mean to use one tense rather than the other? Maybe it might be an idea if I take this thing off, actually. It is. So, English has then the two tenses, present and past. Whenever you use a finite verb, you have to choose present tense or past tense. You've got to make the choice, and the question then arises, what is the difference in meaning? What is the semantic consequence of choosing one tense over the other? Now, in a way, that seems a very silly question. It's obvious what the difference is. The present tense refers to the present. The past tense refers to the past. Fairly obvious. In general, that is true. But there are, as I say, there are complications. There are situations in which this is not the case. And because of this, it's useful to distinguish tense from time. It's useful then to restrict the word tense to refer to the form of the verb and to distinguish that from what these forms mean. So present time and past time would be semantic distinctions. Present tense, past tense would be grammatical, morphological distinctions. Okay. Let's say a few words, first of all, about the present tense. The present tense refers to the present time. But actually, that statement is problematic, because what is the present time? Is it this very moment at which I am now speaking, and which is always changing? Right? Or is it a period of time which includes the present? If you see what I mean. If I say, now, what time is being referred to? Is it that very point in time at which I say the word? Or is it a period of time which includes the point in time at which I say the word? Now, if you look at the word, how the word now is used, in fact, now can be used to refer to actually the actual point, but also, in fact, to very large periods of time. Now, in the 21st century, it makes perfectly good sense. Where now refers to a century, 100 years, which includes the present moment of speaking. Or now, during this lecture, where now refers to a period of time of a couple of hours, which includes the present moment. Okay? The same thing actually happens with the word here. Here can refer to this very point here, at which I am standing, everything else is there. Or here could be here in this room. So here, the present place expands to include the room. Here on this campus, here in China, here in the solar system. You can sort of expand the place that you are referring to by here. And what these have in common is that they include this very point at which I am standing. Now, in fact, if you pursue this thought a little further, you will see actually it doesn't quite make sense to say that the word now refers to the point in time at which I say the word. Because if I say the word now, that takes time. Only a fraction of a second, it takes a 2/10, 3/10 of a second to say the word now, but it takes time. So it actually doesn't make sense to say that now can refer to a point. A point would have no extension. right? Like in geometry, a point has no extension. Okay? Similarly, if I say here where I am standing, I'm not referring to a point, but there is some extent. Now that actually will become important later on, as we shall see when we look at tense and aspect. But I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the notion of present time is not actually a simple, self-evident notion. Because strictly speaking, the present immediately becomes past. Okay. So that, as I say, will become important later on. But there are a couple of other uses where you use the present tense, where it's actually difficult to say whether it actually refers to the present. First of all, it's generally recognized that the present tense is used for so-called generic statements, universal truths, as they are sometimes said. Now, I said a few words this morning, in fact, on generic reference, and this actually is also quite complicated, quite interesting in some respects. If I say something like oil floats on water, I am not referring to any particular quantity of oil floating on water at this particular time. I'm stating a property of water. Water floats on water. Oil floats on water. And the idea would be that this statement is true at the present moment and at all moments. It's always true. And it would be true even if no one had taken oil and put it on water to see whether it floats. Right? It would be true even though no one had actually done it. Okay? This is clear from the third example. If you want to start this machine, you press this button. So you press this button to start the machine. You press this button, which is present tense. That is a general statement about how the machine works, which would be true even though no one had ever pressed the button. And certainly no one is now pressing the button. Okay? So generic statements refer to a situation, refer to what Laneke has called actually the structure of the world, the way the world works, or a theory you have about the way the world works. Okay? One class of sentences actually in which express generic, which have a kind of generic force, and where you typically use the present tense, are so-called middle statements. The kind of thing like, this book sells well. I don't photograph very well. Right? This poem doesn't translate. Right? This poem doesn't translate. Or this poem does translate, as the case may be. This poem translates easily. You are making a statement about a property of the poem, and it is true even though no one might have even tried to translate it. So these are generic statements, and generic statements are actually quite special. But you can see why you use the present tense. You would say that the generic statement expresses a truth about how the world is, how it functions, what things are like, and the truth holds at the present and also at all time. Now, a second case where you use the present tense without specific reference, without any reference to the present time, is in fact in what I've called synoptic narratives. A synopsis, that is, you give a brief summary, a brief précis, of a brief outline of something. And a typical situation would be, for example, you have a newspaper article. Which reports on some event, right? And the article is written in the past tense. But the title of the article is actually very often in the present tense. So you might say, hundreds of people die in the earthquake, right? As the title of the journal, of the article in the present tense. Hundreds die in earthquake or something. But the actual text itself is in the past tense, because it's narrating, reporting an event that's happened. Which is very odd if you think about it. Why should the newspaper article, why should the title of the article be in the present tense if it's a summary of a past event? And the same thing happens actually if you tell somebody the plot of a film or a novel. So you go and see a film and you tell somebody the story of the film, what happens in the film, what happens, you will tell the story in the present tense. And likewise, if you give a summary of the plot of a novel, you will do that in the present tense. Why? Well, I think the reason would be that the synoptic narrative, the summary is valid at all time. Well, it's valid at a period of time including the present. If you give the summary of the article, you are not narrating the event. You are summarizing the narrative, and the summary is the one that is valid now. Okay? Thirdly, a third case would be you actually use the present tense to refer to the future. My plane leaves at 3 tomorrow. Now that, you might think, well, clearly is a future event. You're not describing the present. Or are you? In a sense you are. What the present tense here refers to is not the plane leaving, which is a future event. What you're referring to is the fact that the plane's departure has been scheduled. It is planned, it is scheduled, it's on the timetable. So you would typically use the present tense to refer to the present plan for a future activity. Okay? So if something is planned, scheduled, something is organized, you would typically use the present tense for this. So, we leave at 3 tomorrow. That is something that is planned, scheduled, organized. We are going to leave tomorrow at 3. That expresses your intention. Right? You intend. But it has not, well, in a way it has been planned. But by using different expressions, you actually focus on different aspects. Different facets, actually. So these examples I put at the bottom, the present simple would be typically used here to refer to present plans for future activities. Okay? And as I say, typically used for plans, schedules, timetables, and so on. Now, if we turn to the past tense, okay, it's obvious that the past tense refers to the past. But there are some cases where this doesn't quite seem to be the case. One obvious case would be in novels, in fictional narratives, for example. If you read a novel, or if you write a novel, novels are usually, well, nearly always, narrated in the past tense. Right? So novels are narrated in the past tense. Even though the novel is a work of fiction, the novel is not describing events that happened. It is a work of imagination. Right? So when writing your novel in the past tense, you are not describing events that actually happened in the past. The events did not happen. They are imaginary events. As opposed, for example, to writing a history or a biography. There you are clearly trying to narrate, to tell the story of things that actually happened. And notice that you would use the past tense even for a science fiction, even for a futuristic novel, which is supposed to be describing events in the future. So it would seem that the past tense is the narrative tense. You use the past tense for narrative. A second use is you use the past tense for so-called counterfactuals, things which are contrary to fact. In other words, things which are not the case. And this use is restricted to certain special contexts. For example, if only I knew, past tense. What that means is, or what that presupposes, what that entails is, I do not know. I do not know, but I wish I knew. I do not know, but I wish I did know. And if only I knew. So the past tense, I knew, does not refer to my knowledge at some previous time, but in fact it means it's referring to the present, and in fact the present is the opposite of what I'm saying. So I knew refers to the fact that I do not know. So suppose she told them, meaning she does not tell them. I thought you knew, and it seems that you don't. Okay? So this is a rather special use of the past tense to refer not to the past, but to a situation which is the opposite of what is the case now. Now, there's a third interesting use of the past tense, which I've referred to as pragmatic softening. Again, it's restricted to certain kinds of utterances, where you use the past tense to make what you are saying more polite. Right? For example, what was your name again? Okay, I am asking for your name. What is your name? Now, if you've done, I suppose you do pragmatics and so on, speech acts. If I ask you something, what is your name? I'm asking for personal information. I am imposing on you. I'm asking something from you. Right? And in order to make my request less direct, so that I'm not actually imposing something on you, I can, as it were, soften the force of what I'm doing by putting it in the past tense. Now, what was your name again? Now, I could say that. Now, that could be a situation in which I ask you, what is your name? You tell me, and I forget. Or I didn't hear. But you can say, what was your name? The first mention of this, using the past tense to, as I say, to make my request less direct, less personal. Another very typical one is the second one I've put here. Excuse me, I wanted to ask you something. I wanted to ask you something. This is the first time I ask you. And again, if I ask you something, I am imposing, right? I am asking a favor. I'm intruding into your time and privacy and so on. And to make this request more polite, less direct, you can typically put it in the past tense. So, excuse me, I wanted to ask you something. Now, my wanting is, of course, present. I want now to ask you something, and I am asking you something, or I'm going to ask you something. But I can make this less direct by using the past tense. And in fact, you can make it even less direct by making it progressive as well. I was wanting to ask you something. I was wondering whether you could help me. I was wondering whether you could help me. Again, this is not the past. It's a present. Okay, now, one question that would interest me, and I address this in the prototypes book, as you will probably know, is what do these different uses of the past tense have in common? Why is the past tense used for counterfactuals? Why is it used for pragmatic softening? And in asking this question, I am assuming that the past tense has a meaning, and that you can look at the meaning of the past tense just as you can look at the meaning of any other linguistic form, whether it's a word or whatever. Now, if you're looking for a sort of general meaning of the present and past tense, as I indicated when talking about the examples of the present tense, the content is valid at the moment of speaking, but it need not refer to a currently occurring event or situation. One approach to the past tense is to say that the content of the past tense form is distant from the present. Now, if you are distant from the present, you can be distant in different respects. You can be distant from the present in that it is past. You can be distant from the present in that it is unreal, imaginary, and counterfactual. And in the case of the pragmatic softening, well, you distance yourself from what you are saying, or you distance yourself from the speech act that you are performing. And there are metaphors involved here, grammatical metaphors, if you like, or morphological metaphors. Speech acts can be direct, give me, tell me, show me, or you can distance yourself from what you're doing. I was wondering whether you could tell me. Right? And you are distancing yourself by using a verb form which expresses distance from the present. So there's a kind of very interesting kind of grammatical metaphor there, or so the use of the past tense invokes this metaphor of distance, closeness and distance. Okay, okay, so that is present and past. Now, what makes the matter rather more complicated is the fact that the distinction between present and past interacts with another distinction in English. That is the distinction between progressive and non-progressive. That is the progressive being the be plus ing form. And with present and past tense, progressive and non-progressive, put them both together and you get four forms. I write, I am writing, I wrote, and I was writing. Okay. We'll restrict ourselves to these. And this, as you will be aware, is a major learning problem of English. It's also a major descriptive problem in linguistics, how to distinguish the use of these four forms. Now, my approach to this is, well, I'm going to approach this rather indirectly, and I'm going to approach it by looking at the kinds of situations that verb phrases, or rather, the kinds of situations that clauses and verb phrases refer to. Okay? So I'm going to call these situation types. You can also call them event types. The kind, if I say I write a book, I was writing a book, what these things refer to are different kinds of events, different kinds of situations. So I'm using situation as a kind of general term for whatever it is that verb phrases refer to. Okay? Now, there is a basic distinction between situations which are bounded and situations which are unbounded. And there is a clear analogy here, which I mention in a moment, a clear analogy here between the two major kinds of nouns in English, between the mass nouns and the count nouns, which I talked about this morning. Okay, I'll mention those in a moment, but the basic distinction for understanding the use of these verb forms in English is the distinction between two kinds of situations. Situations which have an inherent end point. Situations which go on, or whatever, and then they stop. And the fact that they stop or come to an end is an inherent, it's part of the meaning, it's part of the concept. And secondly, there are those which, of course, they come to an end, mostly. But when and how and where and whether they come to an end is not actually an inherent component of the situation. Okay? Notice that here I'm talking about the situations, I'm not talking about the verbs as such. But here we have some examples of bounded situations and unbounded situations. And the linguistic terms which are often used to refer to these are perfective and imperfective. Okay, so a bounded situation would be that of writing a novel. It is bounded because the situation goes on until such time as the novel is finished. Right? If you start writing a novel and you don't finish writing it, you cannot be said to have written a novel. Right? You only can be said to have written a novel if you write it and you finish it. Right? So the situation goes on, and then there's a natural point at which it comes to an end, and the event, the situation, is completed. Before that, you have a different kind of situation. So to write a novel would be perfective. Right? It comes to an end when, and only when, the novel has been finished. Likewise, if you write the situation, write 10 novels. Right? That comes to an end when the 10th novel is finished. These expressions here, I haven't put these in sentences. These are sort of infinitive uninflected forms, actually. Compare that with, for example, write novels. To write novels, that would be imperfective because there is no point, there's no predetermined point at which the event comes to an end. You can write 2, 3, 4, you can keep on. Right? You can stop after any novel, or you can keep going on writing more. So to write novels, plural, is unbounded, it is imperfective. As opposed to write 10 novels, which is perfective. To write a novel every year, that is imperfective because of every year. Right? But to write a novel every year for 10 years becomes bounded because it stops after year 10. Spend every weekend at home would be imperfective. Okay, to look at the first ones, write a novel, write 10 novels, spend 10 days in Beijing. That comes to an end after the 10th day. Walk a mile, that comes to an end when you've finished the mile. But to walk for mile after mile is imperfective. To arrive home would be perfective because the event stops when you get home. Now, okay, spend, the second group, imperfective, spend every weekend, like Chinese food, that is a state which continues. To be tall, well, that is inherently unbounded. To know the answer would be unbounded. On the other hand, to find out the answer would be perfective. Right? Feel tired would be imperfective. Okay, so that is an absolutely crucial, absolutely important conceptual distinction for English verb forms. And notice I am not talking about actual verb forms. It's the conceptual distinction between two kinds of situation. And it's not so much a distinction between any objective, actual properties of the situation, but how you look at them. Right? So if you are a novelist, what do? You write novels. you can talk about what you do in terms of perfective activities, right? You are the author of 10 novels, you have written 10 novels, perfective, or you write novels, well, you have written many novels. That is imperfective. Okay, now, there is a similarity, there is an analogy, which many people have pointed out, between the perfective and imperfective situations and between count and mass nouns. Okay, I'll briefly rehearse the count and mass nouns. A count noun would be a noun like table. It has a plural, 1 table, 2 tables. It contains numerals. Mass nouns would be a noun like air. You cannot say 1 air, 2 airs. Well, no, you can't, I don't think. Okay, you are familiar with the grammatical distinction between count nouns and mass nouns. Okay, count nouns have plurals, and they also have a whole set of other grammatical and distributional properties. Now, essentially, the distinction between your count and mass is the same as your distinction between the perfective and imperfective. The characteristics of the bounded situations, things like to write a novel, to write 1 novel, these are similar or analogous to things, that is, or objects. That is what it is that count nouns refer to. If you take a count noun like table, why is that a count noun? Well, it refers to a thing. The thing has a boundary, right? It's a table, and here it stops. Okay? Secondly, its parts do not count as an instance of the thing. So if you take a table and you cut it up into pieces, you do not end up with so many tables. You end up with so many bits of table. So the bit of a table that you end up with if you smash it is not the same thing as the table. On the other hand, if you take a piece of meat and you cut it up into 2, each part is still the same kind of thing as what you started out with. Meat, you still end up with meat. More of it, but it's still the same kind of thing. You end up with more of the same thing rather than so many different things. Okay, do you follow that? Okay, now looking at this also from a... Okay, so... And, okay, the unbounded situations, things like to write novels, would be analogous to a substance, as I say, like meat or water, no inherent boundary, etc. Now, let's look at these differences a bit more closely. Just a moment, yes. Okay, an example of a count noun would be a noun like, I'll take an example I looked at this morning, lake. Lake, which is water. It has an inherent boundary. It's part of the concept of lake that there is a mass of water and then there's the land around it. There is the shore, right? That is part of the meaning of the word. If you don't have the boundary, all you have is water. Okay? So the boundary is part of the meaning. Even though you might think, well, one part of the lake is just as much water as the other part of the lake. But if you zoom in on the part of the lake, what you have is not a lake, but you simply have water. So the part is different from the whole because it hasn't got the boundary. Okay. Now, how does this work then for situations? Well, if you take the situation of you are a novelist and you write novels, this means, well, clearly the activity of writing novels started sometime, and clearly it will stop sometime. right? At the latest when you die. So the activity of writing novels does have a beginning and does have an end, but there's no inherent end point. Just as a piece of meat, of course it has a boundary. It doesn't cover the whole universe. But the boundary is not part of the meaning of the word meat. Okay? So there's no inherent boundary. And also any portion of meat is still meat. So any portion of the activity of writing novels is writing novels. Right? And it can be replicated. You can keep on writing novels and it's still the same activity of writing novels. Whereas write a novel, if you go on and do it again, then of course you write two novels. Or write another novel. You have another situation. Okay. That is actually the first and very important distinction that needs to be made between, as I say, the bounded and unbounded situations, perfective and imperfective. Now, we've been looking at this in a fairly abstract sense, and I've been, basically appealing to intuition and common sense and whatnot. But there are certain linguistic tests for whether a situation is perfective or imperfective. And here are some well-known tests for this. She wrote the novel in 6 months. Now, if you say in 6 months, well, 6 months is a fixed period of time, and that is compatible with a bounded or a perfective situation. You could not say she wrote novels in 6 months. Right? She wrote novels in 6 months is nonsense. So you have a very clear actual grammatical distinction here. You can actually see again, you can explain this in terms of a spatial metaphor. In refers to a container. The container has a boundary, and within this bounded container, the novel is written. So the bounded event takes place within a bounded period of time with a boundary. But as I say, she wrote the novel, so she wrote novels in 6 months is nonsense. Now here we get our first reference to the progressive. She was writing the novel in 6 months is also nonsense. And to anticipate, the imperfective be writing has the effect excuse me, has the effect of converting the perfective event into an imperfective event. Right? It takes away the boundary. Okay? So it took her 6 months to write the novel. To take a certain amount of time, to take 6 months, that is compatible with perfective event. It took her 6 months to write novels. Doesn't work. Right? Actually, it could work. Can you think of a situation in which you might say that and it would make sense? In the sense that the novel writing took place during those 6 months. Doesn't work. But it could make sense if it took her 6 months in order to decide to write novels. That would be one interpretation of that. But that is a bit sort of far-fetched. So for appeals to imperfectives. If you say, she wrote the novel for 6 months, you could say that, but it would mean that the novel, it would not mean that the novel got finished. Right? She worked on the novel for 6 months. She wrote the novel for 6 months, but she didn't finish it. So for is compatible with an imperfective situation. And again, as I pointed out, the ing form has the effect of making a situation imperfective. So you have something like, she has been writing novels since her childhood. So basically there are two tests, the in test and the for test. In a certain amount of time, for a certain amount of time. A couple of other observations here. If I say she was writing novels, again we're getting onto the progressive, entails, entail entailment, that is a logical relation. If the first sentence is true, the second has got to be true. Right? If it is true that she was writing novels, it is also true that she wrote novels. If it is true that she was writing the novel, it is not necessarily true that she wrote the novel. Okay? So she was writing the novel. The progressive makes that situation imperfective. It has no end point. It is not stated that the novel was finished. So she was writing the novel. It does not follow that she wrote the novel. Okay? So the first sentence here, she was writing the novel, does not entail that she wrote the novel. Okay, now to sum this up so far, we would say that the simple sorry. That's right. Yeah, perhaps I'll go on to this one. If we look at these, well, return to the 4 examples I mentioned at the beginning earlier. I write, I am writing, I wrote, I was writing. And look at what they mean. I wrote a novel. Okay, this is a perfective event. The novel was completed in the past. The writing activity took place in the past. Make that imperfective. I was writing a novel, so make it progressive with the ing form. That has the effect of making the situation of writing the novel imperfective. I was writing the novel. So be writing a novel is the novel writing activity, and it refers to a part of this which does not have the actual end point. And this is then located in the past. Perhaps it becomes necessary, might be useful to do a kind of diagrammatic representation of this. Okay. Can you hear me without me shouting? Okay. Okay. That is time. And let's just say the activity of writing a novel is that, and that is when the activity comes to an end. Right? So you start writing and you write, and you stop when the novel gets finished. Now, be writing a novel can refer to any subcomponent of that, excluding the final point. Or indeed, it can be all of that. Any component of that is be writing a novel. And it is imperfective. It is any part is the same as any other part. Okay? And they say the effect of the progressive is to make the perfective situation imperfective. Now, say I was writing a novel, it's imperfective, it designates a subpart, an arbitrary subpart of the writing activity which occurred in the past. Okay, now, what becomes interesting is if you put these in the present tense. I write a novel now is, as we know, not possible. Right? If I ask you, tell me about your present activities, you cannot say, I write a novel. Doesn't work. What you would have to say is, well, I'm writing a novel. And why is that? Well, I think the reason is that I write a novel takes time, and if we say that the present tense in English refers to the present time, it is not possible for the completed event, the perfective event, to take place when you speak. Right? So I write a novel at the moment is not possible in English because the complete event, right, up to its conclusion, cannot occur at the present moment of speaking. Right? All you can do when referring to the present is to use the imperfective, I am writing a novel, because any subcomponent of that can be true at the moment of speaking. This is okay because an instance of the imperfective situation is valid at the moment of speaking. Okay, so perhaps if I got these slides in the wrong order, I think, is that the simple non-progressive designates a perfective situation or an instance of an imperfective situation. Okay. Now, of course, if you take a verb or a situation which is itself imperfective, then of course you can use the present simple. I am tall is okay. You don't have to say, and in fact you couldn't say, I am being tall, because I am tall, to be tall is in itself an imperfective situation, and any sub-component of that can be true at the moment of speaking. Okay. So a couple of observations here. You will see that it is not verbs as such which are perfective or imperfective, which are bounded or unbounded. It doesn't make sense to say that the verb to write is perfective or imperfective, or that the verb to write refers to a bounded or an unbounded situation. It is actually the verb plus its complements, its direct object, and sometimes even its subject. So write a novel versus write novels. It is the property actually of the, in this case, it's the property of the object. Whether the object, in fact, is mass or count, in fact. So that's the first point. Second point is that the situations denoted by verb phrases, again, it's not actually the property of the verb phrase, it's not a property of the situations as such, but actually of the way in which speakers construe, interpret, look at the situations. And summarizing the point again, essentially, the essential function of progressive is to make something imperfective. Now, it gets more complicated. Because I said I write a novel is impossible in English. In fact, it's not impossible. There are situations in which you could say, I write a novel every year. If you add that, I write a novel every year, it suddenly becomes possible. Right? Now we want to look at why this is so. And here we need to make some more distinctions. So a perfective situation is one that has an end point. Okay? Now, you can make a distinction between two kinds of perfective situations, situations with an end point. those which are punctual, or which are thought of as being punctual, things which occur at a point in time, which actually have no duration. Well, in fact, they do have duration, but you don't consider the fact that they have duration. For example, to cough once. Not to cough repeatedly, but to cough once would be a punctual event. To arrive home would be a punctual event, namely it takes place at the time at which you actually cross the door, if you like. You are climbing a mountain and you reach the top. That would be a punctual event. That very point, okay, you're climbing, and then you reach the point, reach the top. That is an event, and it doesn't actually have duration. Die, be born, to finish the novel, the point at which you write the last full stop at the end of the last chapter, that is to finish the novel, or to start the novel and so on. Now, punctual events occur at a point in time. So the test for this is the use of at plus a point in time. So you start the novel at whatever. You arrive home at 3:30. But you could not say she wrote the novel at 3:30. Obviously not, because writing a novel takes time. Notice that if you take the word cough and you add twice to it, to cough twice, it is no longer punctual. What you have is two punctual events, which becomes an extended event. An extended event takes time. Like to go home takes time, but to arrive home takes place at a point in time. So to cough once is a punctual event, to cough twice is an extended event. It's also perfective because it stops after your second cough. If you cough many times or cough repeatedly, then that becomes imperfective because there's no natural endpoint. See, it gets a bit complicated, but it's actually very logical, actually. Now, okay, so those are two important distinctions for perfectives. Now, you can make distinctions also in the class of imperfectives. These can be stative or dynamic. Now, stative is possibly a notion which is quite familiar. It's often used in grammatical descriptions. A stative situation simply persists, it goes on, and there is no real change. There might be change, actually, but you don't actually focus on that. Things like to like cheese. I like cheese is a stative situation. Nothing happens. Right? Nothing actually happens. Or I am tall, again, it simply goes on. Or I know the answer. It is a state of knowledge and it simply goes on. So stative situations simply go on with no change. And you can contrast those with dynamic situations in which things happen. Right? Things happen. Like to write novels, things happen. To grow taller, as opposed to be tall, to grow taller, things happen. Right? So a dynamic situation is one in which things happen, things change. Now, it becomes a bit more complicated still, pursuing this matter. If you take a punctual event like to cough, excuse me, a punctual event can be repeated or iterated. If it is repeated, then you can have an extended perfective like to cough twice, or to cough many times, or to go on coughing, or to cough repeatedly. Now what you have here, to cough repeatedly, to cough many times, it is an imperfective situation. because there's no natural endpoint. It is dynamic because something happens, namely you keep coughing. Now, if you think about how you would interpret a statement like, the child is coughing, the child is coughing, that could only mean that the child is repeatedly coughing, it is imperfective, and the imperfective is compatible with the present tense. It could not mean, listen, the child makes one cough. So you have the iterative situations. In other words, when something is iterated, when something is repeated, if it is repeated an indefinite number of times, even though the situation itself is perfective, it becomes imperfective, and therefore it becomes compatible with the progressive. Now, iterative or repeated situations are in fact very similar to habitual situations. If things are repeated, if a perfective event, if a perfective situation is repeated often enough, it becomes, if you like, a habit. And habit is something that is stative, it simply goes on. So if you take write a novel, is perfective, but if you write a novel every year, you are repeating this for an indefinite number of years, it becomes this is a habitual, and in fact it becomes a kind of stative. Right? There is the stative situation whereby you write a novel every year. And given that it is a stative and imperfective, it therefore becomes quite possible to say, I write a novel a year. At the moment, I write a novel a year. That is perfectly possible. At the moment, I write a novel, period, is not possible. Right? But at the moment, I write a novel a year is okay. And it could be true even though I am not actually now at my desk writing. Just as it would be true to say, I have eggs for breakfast, even though I am not now eating my eggs. Okay? To have eggs for breakfast becomes a habit because it is repeated. And the habit is stative and can be true at the moment of speaking. Now, in fact, let's see, can we, rather than to project this, I'll simply write it on the blackboard. It probably is clearer that way. So we would say we have two kinds of situation. It's okay, I'll do it like this. You have two kinds of situation, the bounded, unbounded, that is the perfective, imperfective. These can be divided up into punctual and extended. That is, to cough once, or to write a novel. These can be divided into stative and into dynamic. Stative, something like to be tall, it simply goes on. Dynamic, to write novels, things happen. But punctual events can be repeated. So if punctual events are repeated, like to cough, you cough many times. If they are iterated, they in fact become one of those. If they are repeated, they become one of those. If an extended event is repeated, like to write a novel, if you write a novel every year, it becomes a habit. Or a habitual, and that becomes stative. So you have this remarkable or interesting property whereby the bounded situations, like to write a novel or to cough once, can actually become unbounded. Okay, it gets more complicated still. The stative situation, like to be tall, or the children like school, stative situations can in fact change. They can become more intense, more frequent, or whatever. And once they change, they actually become dynamic, like dynamic imperfectives. So the children like school is okay, but you can say the children are liking school more and more. There is change. So the children are liking school more and more is possible. So the stative then becomes actually dynamic on the right-hand side of that. Now you can also say the children are now liking school, but the implication there is that there has been change. The children are now liking school would carry the implication they didn't like it before. Okay? And that's actually, yes, and that actually helps to explain some of the puzzles here. The difference between the questions, where do you live and where are you living? Where do you live and where are you living? Okay, both questions ask about your address. Right? But what is the difference? Well, to live in a certain place, that would be a stative, and as such would typically be used with, well, would have to be used with the simple. So where do you live is the normal question for asking about a person's residence. But if I say, where are you living, that actually conveys something else. All right? It's being used as a kind of dynamic. Not that your living in this place changes, but it carries the implication that you have changed your address. Or perhaps the implication that you are a person who is always changing your address. Well, where are you living now? Every time I ask you, it's a different place. Likewise, where do you work? What is your place of work? And where are you working now? That suggests that you have changed your place of work. Okay? Now, can you get the next one? That man is stupid, and he's being stupid. If you say he's stupid, that is stative. That is a property of this person. He is stupid. Right? A fixed, stative, unchanging property. He is stupid. But he's being stupid. That becomes dynamic. It means he is behaving, saying stupid things. Now you are being stupid. It does not mean that you are stupid by nature, but now you're doing things which are stupid. It becomes dynamic. Look at the first one. To die is a punctual verb, and punctual verbs, even punctual verbs, cannot be used with the present simple. But you can say of somebody, she is dying, where what you are referring to is not the actual punctual event, but you can interpret it to mean approaching. Likewise, we are now reaching the top of the mountain, becomes imperfective. It means that you are actually approaching that point at which you would reach the mountain. To arrive is a punctual event. So he was arriving at 10 o'clock this morning wouldn't work if you are talking about the event at 10 o'clock. But you can say the guests were arriving all morning. Because there are lots of guests and lots of arrivals, the punctual event now becomes an extended dynamic event. Okay, let me just look at this one. So, summarize. The remarkable fact about English, about the present simple, is that it is compatible only with imperfectives. So things like, okay, I am tall works. They are reaching, I am now reaching the summit works, but only if it is an imperfective, namely gradually approaching the situation of reaching the summit. So here you have the well-known contrast. What do you read at the moment? I read a thriller, does not work. You have to say, what are you reading at the moment? I am reading a thriller. I like cheese is okay because it's a stative. I eat cheese is not okay if it refers to what I am doing now. But it is okay if it refers to my habit of eating cheese. There is, however, one kind of exception to this, where you can use the present simple to refer to a situation, a perfective situation, if the perfective situation occurs simultaneously with your utterance. And that is given by that class of sentences, class of utterances known as performatives. A performative sentence is a sentence in which you do what you say you are doing, typically with the word hereby. I hereby declare the meeting open, by saying that the meeting is open. So I promise I won't tell anybody. That is a promise because I've said it. Saying the words is the promise. So the speech act is, by definition, simultaneous with the time at which you make the utterance. Okay? And that is one of the few cases in which you can use the present simple for a situation which actually does have an endpoint, but only if that situation, that event, is simultaneous with the utterance, and that would occur if the utterance is what it says, the so-called performative speech acts, typically marked by hereby. Right? In saying this, I declare the meeting open. I hereby declare the meeting open. Okay? Okay, and that basically concludes my talk. We can have questions, if people have questions or comments or objections or queries. I'm pleased to answer those. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.